Hey guys, it's Thorn. Oh, it's like weird seeing me in natural light. Here, let's change the backdrop. There, with books in the background, I look smarter, right? Yeah. So this is a video inspired by a comment on my last video in which I rambled a little bit about hunting. One viewer asked if I thought that part of the reaction against hunting that comes from a lot of pagans stems from a reaction that people might have against a particular kind of conception of political conservatives and Republicans. You know, people think of Sarah Palin, right? And I don't know, like Sarah Palin, like running around Alaska, like shooting baby grizzly bears or something like that. I don't know. And whether or not that's just kind of a gut reaction, and that those two things are related. So anyway, I don't know. I imagine probably, although I don't think that's entirely the reason. But what this is actually about is paganism and regionalism. And if I were a more committed academic, if I were planning on pursuing a PhD, and if I cared enough to write academic papers anymore or go to conferences, which I do not, I would do this. And someone should do this. So, religious studies scholars out there, why don't you get on this? Someone needs to do something about neo-paganism and regionalism in the United States, because there is a tendency in academic circles, and I think to a lesser extent pagan circles, but mostly academic circles, to assume that American pagans, and particularly Wiccans, because usually when academics are writing about pagans, they're usually writing about some kind of generic sort of Wicca. There's this assumption that American neo-pagans are liberals, Democrats, hippies, nudists, right? Like, we think about those things as being related somehow. Academic studies tend to concentrate on pagan communities in California, particular liberal kind of pockets in the Midwest, like Indiana and like the elf community. And people forget, or people don't realize, that there are Republican pagans out there. There are conservative pagans out there. There are pagans who adhere to particular kinds of political and moral systems that have nothing to do with voting Democrat and like being a liberal, or whatever that even means. Okay, this is not me trying to espouse on these kinds of like the meanings behind these particular kinds of categories, but so here, for example, in the South, I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina, and it is very, very apparent that pagans in this part of the country are different than the pagans that I was surrounded by when I lived in Washington, D.C. And they're different than pagans who I've met in New York or Michigan or some of these other places that I've lived. When I go down to visit my family in Alabama, pagans, again, look different. So I think depending on where we live, right, like this is the regionalism I'm talking about, these things impact our practice, our conceptions of what it means to be pagan, etc. So I think there's this tendency, again, especially in academic circles, but I think to some degree in pagan ones too, there's this tendency to assume that because we identify as pagans, we have more in common with each other than we do necessarily with other kinds of religious groups in the areas in which we live. And I found that that's not really the case. I find that, like Southerners, for example, tend to have more in common with other Southerners, whether they're pagan or not, than they do with pagans out in California or something like that. Because down here, a lot of the pagans that I know, they fit in with these particular kinds of, I don't want to say, like, like there's some stereotyping here, but there are particular things that people associate with being Southern that Southerners tend to have in common with each other regardless of their religious affiliation, right? So I'm surrounded by pagans who vote Republican and think about things like, like hunting and like some of these other issues that wouldn't necessarily come up in other regions. So that's interesting. So anyway, I would be interested in what other people thought about that. I'm saying this awkwardly. What people thought about the relationship between their paganism and the region in which they are pagan, because I think in the United States that matters, and I'm just focusing on the United States because I don't know enough about other places. But yeah, I need somebody to do an ethnographic study on conservative Republican Wiccans in North Carolina. Like, that needs to be a thing, because those people are out there. So anyway, that's all. Hope you guys are having a good day. I have to go and finish an academic paper, my last one, that is actually due in an hour, and I'm totally not going to make that deadline. But I'm graduating, so I don't care anymore.